Common wisdom about this year's elections is that Democrats can only win if they do not run on their records as Democrats. They can only win if they do everything they can to convince voters that they're not even really Democrats. They can only win by highlighting the issues that Republicans believe should be highlighted. Another great example of Beltway common wisdom being exactly what Republicans want it to be. But not all Democrats are going along with it this year. Some are defying the dumb common wisdom and running aggressive campaigns that not only tout their own accomplishments as Democrats, but also attack their Republican opponents for what the Democrats see as politically indefensible conservative extremism. A few weeks ago, we showed you an ad that is still one of the best examples out there of a Democrat committing politics, going on the offense against her opponent. It is an ad from Illinois Congresswoman Debbie Halverson, in which she targets Republican Adam Kinzinger for his stance on Social Security. Check it out.
And Adam Kinzinger supports plans to raise the retirement age.
How old do you have to be to retire?
It's not right. Don't even think about it. Adam.
You just don't get it.
Don't you dare.
Keep your hands off of my Social Security, Adam.
You're out of your tree.
You're a young guy, and you got a lot to learn, Adam.
You're out of your tree. Debbie Halverson, the congresswoman behind that ad, is a first-term Democrat who unseated a Republican to win her seat in the 11th District of Illinois. When we first came across that ad last month, we pointed out that essentially all Democratic candidates could run some version of that anywhere in the country. Not only does the ad nail the Republican Party on a party position that they really don't want to be associated with, it also defends a cornerstone Democratic Party value. Weeks later, we are seeing more Democrats join Congresswoman Halverson in defying the common wisdom. Take Democrat Russ Feingold, who's in the fight of his career against Ron Johnson to try to hold on to his Senate seat in Wisconsin. Here's Russ Feingold landing a punch for Social Security.
Mr. Johnson says where Social Security is concerned, everything's on the table, even privatization for some. Here's my position.
Subtle. Privatizing Social Security off the table for Senator Feingold, no matter how many globes or tea kettles or hot air popcorn poppers he has to sacrifice in order to illustrate the point. Another economic issue Democrats have been on offense about is outsourcing, specifically how Republicans who claim that they're for job creation have been themselves personally responsible for shipping American jobs overseas. Once again, we bring you Senator Russ Feingold.
Unfair trade practices by China destroyed our mill.
While Russ Feingold is leading the fight against these abuses and bad trade deals, Ron Johnson endorses deals like the one we have with China.
He calls it creative destruction.
As the CEO of HP, Carly Fiorina laid off 30,000 workers.
When you're talking about massive layoffs, which we did, perhaps the work needs to be done somewhere else.
Fiorina shipped jobs to China. And while Californians lost their jobs, Fiorina tripled her salary, bought $1 million yacht, and 5 corporate jets.
I'm proud of what I did at HP.
Barbara Boxer, Russ Feingold, Debbie Halverson, Democrats running against common wisdom on the economy. Democrats running on the economy on their own agenda and against the Republican economic agenda. In a way that the common wisdom this year says Democrats are not supposed to do. You guys are supposed to be pretending you're Republicans. But in a year when Republicans winning big gains would, first and foremost, result in the country getting the farthest right extreme slate of conservative candidates we have ever elected, certainly in my lifetime and probably in several. Frankly, the biggest step that Democrats have to take across the country is to define who and where Republicans are at this year.
Sharon Angle would wipe out Social Security, Medicare, and she'd privatize the VA.
Oh, she's wild. She's wild.
Okay, so no insurance mandates.
Not if Sharon Angle has her way. That's extreme and dangerous, and she'd make abortion a crime. No wonder Fiorina is endorsed by Sarah Palin. Carly Fiorina, just too extreme for California.
Extreme beauty, extreme sports, good extremes in Colorado. But what about Ken Buck's extreme ideas? Maybe Ken Buck asked the right question.
I'm an extremist. I'm an extremist.
Ken Buck, he shouldn't be speaking for Colorado.
Joining us now is Chris Hayes. He's Washington editor of The Nation magazine and a contributor here at MSNBC. Good to see you, Chris. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Rachel. I'm sitting here in my tree in the Beltway.
Oh, very good. Well, give us some Beltway uncommon wisdom, Mr. Hayes. I feel like from my seat in the liberal media ivory tower here in New York City, I feel like everything coming out of the Beltway is telling Democrats that they need to lay low, run on local issues, hope people don't notice what party you're affiliated with, and just make sure you don't take on anything that might indicate what party you're in. That's the advice that I feel like Democrats are getting. Do you feel like that I'm reading that right?
I think you're right. I mean, I think the problem, right, is that you can't. People understand what a defensive crouch looks like. If you communicate to voters that you're embarrassed about what you're doing, what your record is, what your ideas are, if you're constantly in this. I mean, there's this Joe Sestak ad that I saw about his vote for TARP, and obviously that's a problem for him, right? Toomey had the good fortune of Pat Toomey, his opponent in Pennsylvania in the Senate race, had the good fortune of not having to cast that vote. But the entire 30-second ad was a totally defensive ad. Everything about it said, basically, I am validating the attack of my opponent. And I think you're absolutely right. You have to go on the attack the last 2 weeks, particularly because you're right. Look, the record of these people, Buck and Engel and Miller and these folks, it really is genuinely very, very extreme, way, way outside of the sort of spectrum of the center in American politics.
The thing that has surprised me is that extremism is, extremism is in the eye of the beholder. The only quantitative thing that you can say, it's not a value judgment, it's an objective sense, is that you can identify extremism when people are confronted on it and they squirm about it and try to backtrack on their position. And that keeps happening over and over again on privatized VA, privatized Social Security, Second Amendment remedies, all of these other things that they have put forward. Ken Buck squirming on that personhood amendment that would define a fertilized egg as having essentially voting rights in Colorado. Anytime they squirm or change their position on these issues, doesn't that mean keep hitting them on it? You've hit a weak spot?
Yes, absolutely. And I think, look, I think you're going to see more of that. I mean, there's a certain amount of basic understanding of the dynamics of that. You're seeing it in the angle race with Harry Reid, where he really has made Social Security an issue. And it's a major talking point. In fact, when she told him to, quote, man up in the debate, she was responding to an attack over Social Security privatization. She understands that that's a weakness for her. So you're going to see more of it. I will say this, though. It is a little weird that none of this conversation is happening about the legislative agenda of this Democratic Congress over the past 2 years. I mean, the things that are most effective are these sort of, hoary cliches, these sort of Democratic perennials, which are true and good. I mean, we shouldn't privatize Social Security. We should have a better trade policy. All that stuff is good, ripe stuff to attack on. But it is also completely detached from the legislative record of the Democratic Congress. And that's a little weird, I think.
When you see people float the idea, and only a few members of Congress have done this, only a few incumbents have done this, but some have, and have run ads or have followed a line of attack in debates in particular where they are defending the health care ruling, the health care legislation, when they're defending the idea of health reform, in some cases defending the idea of Wall Street reform, saying that their opponent wants to undo these things. We're seeing a few of them float it, but it's not becoming a national line. Why is that?
That I really honestly don't know. I mean, let's take the case of Wall Street reform, because that's of the entire Democratic legislative agenda, that polls the best. It's by far the most popular in the polls. It was when it's passed. It is now. It's good on the merits. It comes on the heels of the largest financial catastrophe in the last 80 years that the banks caused. Everybody hates the banks. You can beat up on the banks and on your opponent. I honestly don't understand why every Democrat isn't rallying around this piece of legislation and forcing their opponent to defend the status quo, to defend the banks. The only thing I can think of is that they're worried that if they open up that front, then they have to defend the TARP vote. And that TARP vote is hanging like an albatross across the necks of almost every incumbent Democrat. Remember that a lot of them were in Congress and they voted for it. You have more incumbents defending on the Democratic side. The only possible rationale I could come up with for why this isn't a bigger campaign theme is that any invocation of the banks and Wall Street leads people to remember the bailouts, and a lot of Democrats have that vote on their record that they have to deal with.
But even if they're afraid on TARP, you can't, I mean, on partisan grounds, Democrats don't have to be any more afraid of that than Republicans do. I mean, John McCain suspended his campaign and came back to Washington to make sure TARP would pass. Sarah Palin is on record as being in favor of TARP. John Boehner cried on the floor of the House asking people to pass TARP. For Democrats to have that as their albatross, it's a pretty big albatross, and it hangs around the necks of both parties.
Exactly. And the other thing is, look, you have that vote. You can't go back and undo the vote. What you can do is talk about the vote you did take on the right side of the issue. That was against the banks, that the Republicans almost in entirely lockstep voted against. And I understand the White House, I think, did a pretty good job of trying to make this an issue. For some reason, it has not caught on in local races. And I'm frankly flummoxed. I mean, the other argument, right, is that at the same time that these Democrats are trying to win these races, they're also trying to raise a lot of money from the financial sector. And so they have this sort of cross-pressured problem, and it's a huge problem for the Democratic Party, writ large, that they feel like they can't quite lean into that because at the same time they're dialing for dollars on, at Goldman Sachs.
Well, they've got 2 weeks to figure out what side their bread is buttered on.
Yeah,
Chris Hayes, Washington editor of The Nation. Chris, it's always great to have you. Thanks.
Thanks, Rachel.